Hi there, folks.
Hi, Mark.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So we'll give it another minute or so and wait for our other colleagues to join us. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so.
Did we have everyone confirm? Who are we expecting?
Catherine, Liz, Catherine Bisco, Liz Irish was on the invite list. Holly Doyle, I believe, was on the list. Jeff.
Holly just sent me an email about 5 minutes ago. She's dealing with an emergency and so can't make this meeting either. So it'll just.
Okay. So give it, hopefully Liz will be able to join us shortly. So let's formally begin. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sam Imperati, the process facilitator. It is January 11th at 1:04 p.m. This is the time for a joint past CUP and a subcommittee and the legal subcommittee to meet. The narrow purpose of this agenda is to deal with what we've called the introductory language to the CUP section of that subcommittee's report. I'm not trying to be flippant here. I'm just trying to set the stage. We have had many versions of this document go back and forth over the last couple of months. And I am encouraging everyone to see if we can reach consensus on that document. I'm going to share my screen now so that y'all have it in front of you on the screen, in addition to whatever you have. So basically the most recent version is what I sent out in the most recent draft of the legal subcommittee work. I just, for purposes of bandwidth, just copy and pasted the section in question, hoping that things don't crash. So basically what it is the stuff without any kind of track changes and not highlighted are the areas where I think that we're all on the same page and have agreement. My best understanding of where we left off is this first paragraph called implementation of, is where the CUP subcommittee landed. The next paragraph, implementation of, right in here, this is what the legal subcommittee did as far as their suggestions to the above. And then finally, Jenny Lucker read both of these things and then put together that as a way to potentially relate to it. And so we'll, and then again, these other sections here, there doesn't seem to be any huge concerns. So that's, that's the work product. Let's take opening comments and process suggestions, and then we'll dive in. So Mr. Mark, you're up.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So when we had our land use subcommittee meeting on Monday, I think you said you were going to send this out. I have never received this. So this is first time I'm seeing this. I haven't had an opportunity to take a look at this. So just putting that there. And I would appreciate some opportunity to be able to do that.
Of course.
I didn't understand that we were going to be working on this on the fly. The other thought here is that I certainly don't represent the land use subcommittee. We have two other maybe citizen members, if we could call them, I guess, in Ed, Tara, and Catherine Bisco, who had an important part in the process of developing the initial language that the land use subcommittee put out for consideration. So I'm not sure what we can do today with regard to reaching consensus. I certainly am not going to speak for Ed or Catherine, and I really haven't had a time to read or to digest what's being proposed here. So it's I don't know. It's a little frustrating to be able to just now be asked to comment and potentially reach consensus on something we're just seeing now. So I don't know if you did send it out. If you did, I didn't get it. I've been looking in my email, so but not something I've received.
So let me clarify the current state of this document. The only paragraph you have not seen before is what I'm calling the Jenny paragraph. And so that is a fair process critique that you should be able to have time to review that. What you have seen before is the legal subcommittee's response to that document, because that's been pending since at least as of December 20th, unless it's just slipped through the cracks of your email protocol. So have you seen that, Mark?
Oh yeah. And
Okay.
and I think that Ed and Catherine and I had an opportunity to look at this before Ed took off on his trip. And my memory of that conversation is that neither Ed nor Catherine liked what was being proposed back by the legal committee, and maybe that's why we are where we are with yet another version being proposed by the legal subcommittee as drafted by Ginny.
Well, let me clarify. The so-called Jenny paragraph has not been approved by the legal subcommittee. This is her work in her independent capacity. They have seen it, but they have not commented on it either, as far as worked it internally amongst that subcommittee. So for all I know, the only person that thinks this is the right paragraph is Jenny. He said with a smile, because I just don't know. We haven't had that time, he said tongue in cheek for those that might be listening to this recording later and have not gotten the trigger warning about Sam. So I do think, because of where we are on the agenda, that, excuse me, on the timeline to complete this report, we need to come to have some discussions about what we could do with that which already exists. Because I do think, given the dynamics, I would like on Tuesday by midnight be able to send out the most recent version of the work group report and have this language in it. Now, it may well be that it looks exactly like it is now and says, this paragraph CUP, this paragraph legal, this paragraph Jenny Lucker in that capacity, work in progress, not yet resolved. But I don't think we're running out, and Ed's not coming back until I think it's the 30th or the 31st or something, which we can reserve final until then, but we do need to meet progress before now and then. So how comfortable are you, Mark, discussing that which you've already seen and playing it out with the recognition that you can't obviously bind your other two colleagues? No different than, the legal folks can't bind Liz Irish, who's on the legal subcommittee, who's not here today.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so as you know, we've all been involved in lots of different meetings related to the work group. I haven't re-looked at this for a few weeks because of other things that I've been working on. And so it would take me a bit of time to sort of reorient my brain. What I know that when we first developed, well, I think it came as a suggestion from the land use subcommittee that 150-page document that we've been working on for a couple of months now, and each of the specific land use decisions and their related conditions of approval, we felt that it needed some sort of introductory paragraph for the general public to sort of orient them as to what this document is and why it's important. And so the first paragraph that we developed, I think, carefully worded to try to make it as sort of informative, but yet understandable by the general public, person who has no experience in really working with all the legal aspects, of which there are many related to land use rules and conditions of approval, development code, all that sort of stuff. So it was an attempt to have a simple orientation for the public. And then I'm not exactly sure, because I have not gone back and listened to each of the legal subcommittee meetings. I haven't gone back to try to understand the objections, but apparently the legal subcommittee objected to possibly the terms related to land use, a particular resultant activity being compatible with adjacent land uses. And so that's why this language in the middle, as I recall, and I haven't read it for a while, but the intent to say that the fact that it requires a conditional use permit means that it's already compatible. And that I remember when Ed and Catherine and I spoke about the not Jenny's paragraph, but that middle paragraph, people were, the three of us were saying that we didn't agree that was the case. So again, it would be really helpful for Catherine in particular, because she is she's here. I don't know why she's not attending today. I think maybe on Monday she mentioned she might have some conflicts, but it would be good for them to be able to articulate what their concerns were about this middle proposed paragraph. And I think this might have been even the legal committee's second or third version of this, because I know there was some that came back. You know, we've, as you have articulated, we've had so many versions of this, and this maybe was the latest from the legal subcommittee. So I guess part of, and I have not had an opportunity to read Ginny's, but just looking at the volume of information that's there, that seems to me to be inconsistent with a sort of simplified understanding for a person who is not oriented to land use rules and regulations. If there's I don't know what's here, but referring to, you know, I just talking about the conditions of approval can't expand the approval criteria, can't substitute a fine. It just looks to me, just looking at it, that it's very land use oriented for, you know, for a person who might understand about land use activities. Maybe this is okay, but again, I thought we were going to get an opportunity to read this beforehand. I could have maybe more cogent response if I had this previously.
Okay, so let me try to frame this up. So everyone agrees that it needs to be user-friendly from the perspective of those who are not land use wonks. I think that is a secondary issue here to the pivotal substantive disagreement, at least as I understand it. Let's forget Jenny's section for a moment for the reasons that have been articulated and just focus on the two paragraphs that are in dispute. My, quasi layperson view is the only sentence in dispute is the one that I've highlighted. Uses allowed in a given zone have already been deemed to have sufficient level of compatibility or sentences. Therefore, a finding of compatibility with adjacent land uses is not required per se. The rest of the two the one section above and this otherwise, I don't think there's a flyby here. And so I do think it would benefit from at least you hearing why the legal subcommittee believes the addition of those two sentences that are, right here are key for a complete understanding. The downside of simplicity in a situation that's so complicated is, it could leave the reader to jump to their own conclusion. And for whatever reason they can speak for themselves, they felt these two sentences were necessary. So perhaps you all can decide who wants to talk first from the legal subcommittee's perspective and see if we can come up with something here. So whoever is the most intelligent and best looking person on that legal subcommittee, go first. Second best looking and most intelligent? How about anyone who's not in a coma?
So.
All right, folks.
When we talked about that first sentence, it begins uses allowed in a given zone. The point of that is that determining compatibility in a conditional use application is pointless, because every zone in the development code lists A, those uses that are outright permitted, and B, those uses that are allowed conditionally. So there's already been a determination by virtue of the listed uses of compatibility. Now, the uses that are conditionally permitted present the potential to have adverse impacts on adjacent properties or unduly burden public facilities. And as a result, the potential for that adverse impact needs to be mitigated. Hence, their inclusion within the zone as conditional uses. So that's why that first sentence was included, because when the Board of Commissioners, Planning Commission developed the zones and identified the uses, they put together those uses that are inherently compatible. So that's already been determined. The real point of a conditional use is not to determine compatibility, but to mitigate adverse impacts that use may have on facilities and properties. So that's the rationale for that first sentence.
So let me try to, because I may end up having to explain this to the work group. Is the distinction here, again, not from a legal perspective, but from a layperson's perspective, that compatibility is the word that's throwing people off. So for instance, here's this zone in and around Coffin Butte, and it is already zoned to allow a landfill. So by definition, because landfills are allowed, it's compatible with that landfill zone. Second step, and so what I just said in layperson language is the legal version of that. I think what I've heard the CUP folks concerned about is maybe that is not true, that a landfill in a landfill zone still has to prove compatibility with that zone. But where the action is at as a practical matter, when push comes to shove next or later this year, assuming the CUP gets forward, is this. And is that paragraph, that's where the action is going to be at. That's where those opposed to the expansion request are going to have an opportunity to argue, hey, it doesn't seriously interfere with the use in this landfill zone, but the properties next to it could, and those are the adjacent properties. Now, I don't know if those adjacent properties mean outside of the area zoned for a landfill, or there are other adjacent properties that are within the zone for landfill. Maybe that's a distinction that needs to be teased out. So am I making any sense, or am I just more confused than anyone else? Or
Well, I think you did in fact capture, I think, the essence of that first sentence that I was discussing. And yes, for all intents and purposes, the examination of the Planning Commission will be on those two quoted clauses in the highlighted section. Not seriously interfere, and well, I guess the other one is not unduly burden. That is, and I think that is what is missing in the that first paragraph that's presented for the other subcommittee, is some context for what exactly is being asked of the decision maker within the context of an application. It's not to determine whether a use is compatible, but to whether a use can be shown to meet the applicable approval criteria. And I think that's where our committee has diverged from the land use subcommittee, is we're trying to ensure accuracy for that person who comes back and looks at this document in a year, 2, 5, 10, such that it's very clear what will be examined by the decision maker and what will not be examined. And that sentence that you highlighted, this is however land use must be found, that's what will be examined. That's the essence of a conditional use application.
So here's another way to frame it up that I was thinking about it is and I don't mean this disrespectfully, the quibble with compatible with adjacent land uses is a layperson's term that anyone can have a subjective point of view that, oh, it's not compatible because I don't like it. Okay. What I hear now, the legal subcommittee, I hear more clearly, and that's not that you weren't clear before, it's me catching up with the understanding, is that compatible up here is a term of art that means does not seriously interfere, mitigate negative impacts, and whatever that third one is that you said a few seconds ago. So that's where the potential flyby is. Is that compatible with adjacent land uses is a term of art that means it has to comply. It has to satisfy those three versions of compatibility for the conditions of approval. Is that the flyby we're having here? Mark, I really want to.
Well, so here's a couple of things. One is I have to say that I disagree with Vance's premise that the fact that something is listed as a potential use within a zone inherently means that it's compatible, which is what I think I heard him say.
It is.
I think the reason why it's listed as a conditional use is because even though it might potentially be made to be compatible, it has equally the potential to be incompatible with adjacent land uses. And thus, that's why it's not allowed outright. It's not assumed to be compatible. So I think we are approaching it, Vance and I are approaching it from different perspectives. And so when I think about what our original intent was in just putting some introductory language to the 150 pages that the subcommittee's been working on, there's nothing in the 150 pages that I can recall where we ever even mention the review criteria. Character of the area is not mentioned. Undue burden is not mentioned. It's not talked about. So now, if this language were to stand, I think we create a whole nother set of confusion for an average public reader. So I don't know if the solution is to figure out another way to sort of give the average public person an understanding of what the purpose of conditions of approval are in a way that's simple, that doesn't get into listing the review criteria and citing sections of the code and all that sort of stuff. Because the land use subcommittee, basically, as I understand our charge as we embarked on this process, was to review all of the prior land use actions and, to the extent possible, try to make some determination as to whether or not the imposed conditions of approval either had been carried out or have been carried out and maintained. It doesn't, none of the discussion or none of the review was focused on whether or not the conditions of approval were appropriate, whether they were sufficiently definitive to make sure that it didn't cause an undue. We don't talk about the review criteria at all. So now in this process of bringing in the review criteria and trying to, I don't know, justify something, it seems to me to be sort of a rabbit hole that is not helpful. So I don't know if there's a way to say that conditions of approval are necessary in order to, I mean, what we have said is conditions of approval are necessary to ensure that it's compatible. I don't know if the legal subcommittee would be more comfortable if it said conditions of approval are necessary to ensure that it's not compatible or not incompatible, I should say. Again, so my concern is taking 2 sentences and replacing them with 12 doesn't simplify things, in my view. It makes it more confusing, and it goes down into a rabbit hole that has nothing to do with anything that the reader will then read subsequently in the 150 pages. Because we don't talk about seriously interfere, undue burden, or character of the area.
Well, let me just comment on that. I want to distinguish process arguments from substantive arguments. I don't think, I mean, I'm just doing this roughly. These 2 paragraphs, this one adds about 3 sentences. I don't think that from a mere volume, that the difference between these 4 lines and these 8 lines is going to be the tipping point for people to lose track. I think the next issue really becomes to what extent, if any, does the reader of this portion of the overall work group report need to know that the conditions of approval, I mean, need to know that there are these things that have to be complied with or not, because the body of the CUP subcommittee's report doesn't really talk about them. They just assume these were the conditions, and they don't say there were too many or too little. They don't go into that analysis. So at that point, I get, Mark, that it is raising a topic that your work assumes already to have been decided, and no one's going back to relitigate that.
Well, and in fact, we don't know what the review criteria were back in 1974 or 1983. Right. They may not. This may not be the right language. I don't know what was there then.
Yeah, so basically, you're saying that discussion is not germane to really the overall body of your work, and it may be confusing because you don't really then go in and say on land use action 17, condition 3 was imposed because it seriously interfered with the property. You don't say that. So the reader doesn't need to know that going forward. So let's go back up to this and asking the land use committee, what is wrong with that sentence, just as it is? What is the implication you fear a reader will take away that's inconsistent with the reality of the truth of the law? Because otherwise, the rest of the sentences are basically the same.
Well, because compatibility is not the standard. It's not. The standard is seriously interfere with uses on adjacent property, have undue impacts on public facilities, blah, blah, blah. So by using the term compatible, that's not the standard. So going back to what Mark was saying about, that's not, it's kind of misleading on what the committee's doing. I think if you replace that language with something along the lines of the Board of Commissioners imposes conditions of approval on land use applications in order to ensure compliance with the applicable approval criterion. That's a correct statement. And that sort of puts the reader into a position of having to review them, because it's not just, there can be other conditions that go on, conditions of approval that go on that have nothing to do with compatibility, like conditions to improve roads or something like that. So I think that if we're going to say, okay, what is this committee doing? This committee is going back and looking at the past land use applications and determining whether the conditions of approval have been complied with. And they were imposed by the board because at the time the board or whomever, the planning commission, whoever approved that, determined that those conditions were needed to comply with the applicable approval criteria. So if we set something that simple, that would be an intro to the report. But unless we want to actually put the criteria and framework in, which is what the Legal Services Committee tried to do, and I think it looks like what Jenny tried to do, we're potentially misleading them if we're saying that compatibility is the standard, because it's not.
Well, look at this 4 lines here. Is this conversation really as a first step? Can't this be solved by simply putting a period after the word approval and strike the language is compatible with adjacent land uses? Just read that without putting the period after conditions of approval.
It doesn't make any sense if it's got to have something else there, because it just says now assuming compliance with conditions of approval. What?
That no,
So,
I go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, no, I think it doesn't make any sense either.
Yeah, I get your point. I get your point, Sam. It could potentially be reworded to say that it complies with the development code. Although it's not just the development code. So I see where you're trying to go with that.
All I'm suggesting is what I've heard the conversation, we're not making, this section of the report does not make findings on whether or not the conditions of approval were imposed because of compatibility or other things, negative impacts, adjacent property, all that stuff. But all your work group has done is assume the conditions of approval were valid and they're there, and did they comply with them or not?
I guess the thing that I struggle with is trying to find a way to say in English what the review criteria are trying to do when we say that the review criteria are, we're looking at the proposed use with the intent of determining that it's consistent with the character of the area, that it doesn't cause an undue burden, or that, whatever the third criteria is, doesn't interfere with, something or another. That in English, what does that mean? It means compatibility, or that it's not incompatible. To me, if you tried to explain to the average person on the street why those conditions of approval were imposed on a particular proposed land use, the idea is because you don't want whatever the resultant land use is to be a thorn sticking out of the sky, causing a problem. And that to me is compatibility. When Vance is saying, well, it's assumed to be compatible. Well, that's where I disagree. The reason why those review criteria are there is to make sure that the resultant land use activity doesn't create a burden, doesn't interfere with the activities. And all of those things point to making the resultant land use activity reasonably compatible with the people who are living next to it. So I guess I understand, and I think Jeff is 100% correct in that the condition, the review criteria is not compatibility, but trying to explain that in English to the average person, to me, it can't be a list of these three things, because people will say, what does character of the area mean? What does undue burden mean? And that's subject of many, many lawsuits. And, no two attorney, you can find two attorney, no one will agree on what that language means. It's too vague. But it is shooting toward some sort of consistency with land use that's around it, compatibility. I just don't see, besides Jeff's point of saying that is not the standard. I agree that it's not the standard. But in English, how do you say it to someone? Simply, we're trying to make land uses that are adjacent, not conflicting.
So let me pause for a minute. I want to bring in other folks in the conversation. I'm going to ask Liz, and then Inga, and then Jenny to bat clean up for this next round of comments. So Liz, what are your thoughts and reactions? Because you're in the unique position of being on the planning commission. And so hearing your thoughts would be helpful and guidance.
I don't know if my thoughts are very helpful, because I don't find this as complicated as Mark. I think, I've spent a lot of time in the legal subcommittee listening to the logic, and I have 3 attorneys on that legal subcommittee that have agreed to the language and do pretty much agree consistently with the work we've done and the wording we've selected. So to say that you're not going to find 3 attorneys that agree, I think we are in fact agreeing on what all of this means. I think sometimes we complicate things unnecessarily. And I think sometimes we're upset about planning and code, and it comes out in meetings like this, when really the issue is, if you don't like how the code works, right, that's what we need to address. But in this situation, this has already been deemed compatible by the rules. We've established that. And I personally think if we try and complicate it, we will complicate it. We need to work hard at just being very clear, and understand that sometimes when we say things, people just don't want to hear it anyway, because it's not the answer they want. So I know that is not a super friendly way to look at it, and I apologize for that. I don't mean that to be abrasive, but I think that's where we're sitting right now, and that's what I've encountered on this legal subcommittee when talking to other subcommittees. It's already been deemed a compatible use for that land, and I think we can just simply say that and explain that's how that works. But I can look at things super simple. So.
All right, Inga, thoughts, suggestions for moving forward?
I agree that compatible should be taken out of there. And if we're going with that language, then I would think that all of the adjacent property owners would say that the landfill is not compatible with their uses. And that's really not what the code is about. The code is about reducing the impact of the use and mitigating the impact of the use. So it's not about compatibility.
All right, thank you. Jenny, you have 14 minutes to solve this problem.
Yeah, I'm not going to solve this problem. I agree that compatibility, I took compatibility out of it because I don't think compatibility is relevant to the criteria. What I hear Mark saying, I think, is that this is not intended to be looking at the current, a future review based on the applicable criteria, but rather whether past decisions met the criteria that were then in effect. And using the short-term compatible as a way to describe that. And I think maybe I was under the misunderstanding. I was looking to the future when you're looking at a land use application, not the specifics of any particular application, but looking at any potential conditional use permit application, you look at the applicable criteria. And to me, and the role I've had as a decision maker, is that if the public has been told they need to establish compatibility, that's misleading to them when compatibility isn't a standard that is subject to the review. The review criteria are the only criteria that matter. So if people are saying, but it's not compatible, how does that relate to the review criteria? So I don't think it's helpful to the public to use a term that isn't at issue. So that's the problem I had with both of the two paragraphs, was that one was saying it is compatible, one was saying it has to prove compatibility, or it has to, assuming compatibility is proved, and that misses the point. And I get what Mark's saying is that they're trying to use English rather than legalese to describe what these criteria mean. And I think that's potentially unfair to the people who are trying to make sense of it. Because if they think, well, you have to prove compatibility, you can argue compatibility all day long. That's not related to the approved criteria. Now, that is assuming that the inquiry is about going forward. If what you're looking at is what has been done in the past, then Mark, you're right. We don't know what the criteria were in 1974 or 1983 or any other time period. So for context, maybe you could shorten it and just summarize it as these were looking at generally what would be compatible. But that's not going forward what we're looking at.
Well, just to note, the standards have been the same since 1983. I don't think there's been any sense.
Okay, I haven't gone back to look. Okay.
And the 1974 was totally different. Yeah, so.
Okay, the other problem I had with the initial language, and I'm going to take out one term to illustrate where I don't know what it means. Implementation of the land use decision conditions of approval are required to ensure that the proposed land use complies with the resultant land use activity. I don't know what that means. So what it says right now is sure it complies with the development code and the resultant land use activity. But if you take out the development code, what does compliance with the land use complies with the resultant land use activity? I don't know what the intent was in that statement.
I think maybe there's just I don't have it up. It's not on my screen anymore. I think Sam took it down, but I think it's a matter of the resultant land use or the resultant land use activity. That phrase goes with the rest of the sentence, not the prior part. The resultant land use activity is compatible.
Okay.
Yeah, it goes with the second half
Okay,
of the
so
sentence. So maybe it needs a comma or
we
a
need a comma then.
semicolon.
Okay.
Yeah, a
all right.
comma or a
Okay, 'cause
semicolon or
that didn't
something.
make any sense to me. Okay.
Yeah, no, it goes with the second part of the sentence there.
So if there's a way to, I get what Mark's trying to do is summarize what the criteria are without using the criteria language to make it more user-friendly. I'm concerned that trying to make it user-friendly hurts the public who are trying to comply with what the rules are.
That's my concern as well.
I hear the concern, but again, from my perspective, I'm happy to listen to some proposal that says simply what the objective of the review criteria are. There is an objective, and the objective is either to make the proposed land use less conflicting with the neighbors, compatible. I mean, we could brainstorm what are the
Isn't it-
review criteria trying to do?
Aren't they trying to get to the point where it's not seriously interfering with the adjacent property?
Potentially, I mean, depending on how you
Well,
define.
because
No.
that's in the code, is that the conditional use criteria are intended to make sure that any resulting activity doesn't interfere with adjacent property. And the way the code does that is by the review criteria.
Right, and doesn't interfere. I would guess that Jeff would argue that's not the right term, because I think in previous things that I've heard or listened to the discussions of the legal committee, well, it's assumed that it's going to interfere. It's just we just don't want it to
It's seriously
interfere. And
So
and then and then you get into the whole discussion of what does seriously interfere mean? What does undue burden? We're acknowledging it is a burden, but is it an undue burden? And that's where it gets really into I think Sam characterized it as land use wonkiness. And I don't know how to get out of the wonkiness. And clearly everyone is, well, most of you, we don't have Catherine or Ed here to argue on behalf of compatibility or to argue for some other public person's perspective. You're only listening to me at this point, and I'm not speaking on their behalf, but they felt very strongly about that language. So I don't know how we thread that needle.
Could we, I would hate to make the introductory language too long, but could we just copy and paste the criteria of approval into that introduction? Say this is from 1974, this is what we used to create conditions of approval, and after 1983 and beyond, this is the criteria we used to create the conditions of approval, and leave it at that.
Well, again, that doesn't really work for me, but I'm not speaking on behalf of Catherine and Ed.
What about-
Explain why.
Yeah, I guess because of the average person's lack of understanding or difficulty in understanding the terms seriously and undue. Those things, is it 10 trucks a day that seriously interfere with my use of my property, or is it 150? And so it's that sort of thing where
But we're not-
and I hear that we can argue that same thing about compatibility or incompatibility. I'm hearing that 100%. So I understand that. I don't know how we thread the needle there to be able to say simply, we're trying to make sure that whatever the resultant land use doesn't conflict with adjacent land uses.
But Mark, we're not making, by just stating what the criteria we are not therefore making that supposition that someone is going to make their own decision on what unduly interferes with and seriously impacts is. And that is also what the planning commission members did and staff did at that time. We're not, it sounds like we don't want to go there because we're never going to come to an agreement on how to explain that. So just by putting down, this is what we looked at, and then If you want to know what planning staff thought at the time based on this criteria, or the planning commission, look at the minutes or look at the staff report. Because by trying to explain that, we're not going to come to a decision here. We're not to come to something that we all agree upon.
Mark, are you looking for a consensus? Is that what you're looking for? Language that the public can just be like, oh, I get it. This is clear. It makes sense to me the majority of the time. Is that what you're looking for?
That would be great. It would be great if we could reach consensus in a simple way. Again, I haven't had an opportunity to read what Ginny has written, so I don't know if there's
And
something.
I think, Mark,
that
you'll
can-
find that way too legalese.
Okay, well, there may be something in there that can be extracted. I don't think it's appropriate because I don't agree, but I don't know. I mean, again, consensus or not consensus, but to say that simply because a potential use is listed under conditional uses in a zone, that means per se that it's compatible, which is what Vance is saying. I strongly object to that. I think Ginny, in one of your last calls, talked about a church use in a residential area. And well, generally people think a church could be good, but if they're having parties till 3 o'clock in the morning as fundraisers, that wouldn't be considered to be compatible.
So I think that here lies the problem then. I don't know what you're wanting to achieve is achievable. I don't think that it's practical. I don't know even in my day job that if I attempted to explain the processes of what I do and the reasons why my clients have to perform in a certain way, that they may agree that that's reasonable, but they still have to do it. And we're back to advising commissioners and making suggestions and having a public document about where we arrive. We're not supposed to solve this problem. We're not necessarily supposed to write everything in a language that every human being could possibly understand completely, because I don't know that that's an achievable goal.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to do that. Remember that the land use subcommittee is not advising anyone on anything except for what we think, based on what we've read for prior land use decisions and related conditions of approval, whether they're in compliance or not. It's not advising anyone on anything.
But
This is the intro to the land use subcommittee's report. It's not an introduction to the whole document of everything the Benton County Tox Trash Work Group is doing. It's just for this section.
But you are saying that you disagree with the language that 3 attorneys from different positions have said they agree with, and you're saying you disagree with that language because it doesn't explain enough. So that leads me to believe that you want this document to come to some kind of conclusion or go into more detail than I think we can possibly do. Right? Because you don't want it too difficult, you don't want it too complicated, but you want it clear and decisive. And to go clear and decisive would be maybe an oversimplification of what can and can't occur and how it occurs and why it occurs and what it was like in 1974 versus like what it is today. Right? Like you want it to be detailed enough that people can understand, but you don't want it to be too complicated. And I think therein lies the problem.
Well, why not?
Let me
Why not?
jump in at this point. My internet at my home, literally they shut it all down. Apparently they're upgrading the service, but while they're upgrading the service, I have no service. So I'm on my cell phone, which I've never done before for a call. So I hope to get through. So not hearing all of the things that were said in the last 10 minutes, and given the fact that we are literally out of time for this particular afternoon seance, I am going to suggest that I'm going to talk with Jenny, and maybe she can call me on my office line after this meeting, if not now, whenever she can, and see if we can come up with some way to thread the needle here. I believe the nub of disagreement is an allowable condition in a zoning area sufficient proof of compatibility such that a independent finding on its compatibility needs to be made or not. And then regardless, assuming it doesn't need to have it because it's already an allowed use, the ultimate issue that I think the CUP is going to rise or fall on is still there, which is all the adjacent use issues. And so I'm thinking of this, and I'm not trying to put words in people's mouths, but I'm thinking of this as, I always think about people's language in these reports are they trying to put a, sort of black letter version of the law, or are they moving the pizza a little closer to them for use, subsequent use at the hearing before the planning commission or the board to say, see, Benton County Talks Trash said in their report that you have to make two findings. One, that this allowed use is compatible with that zone. And then two, that any condition and that what conditions are imposed so it doesn't interfere with others. That's all I'm trying to get at is what are the ground rules, not the resolution of those ground rules, not the resolution of, what that is. So is it as simple as that? Are you basically saying, Mark, you believe there should be two analyses that the planning commission and the board should make? First, is the existence of Coffin Butte and the expansion compatible, even though it's already a landfill zoned area? And then second, a somewhat different analysis, which is impact on adjacent uses. Is that literally what you're saying? There's two prongs of analysis.
Yeah, it's not, there was no intention on the drafting of the first paragraph, the 4 lines, to plant in some document, something that someone was going to point at in the future with regard to compatibility. I understand what everyone is saying here with regard to the concern about the term compatible. What I don't understand is how then we get the determination as to whether or not something is actually incompatible. So again, what I tried to do there was simply try to put in some language that summarized the goal of the review criteria. And I think part of the problem is the goal of the review criteria is seen from different mindsets. What I hear Vance and Inga saying is that it's to make sure it's not too bad, that it doesn't cause such a big problem. We can mitigate whatever bad things are happening. And I don't see it that way. I see it as the goal of the review criteria are to make sure it's consistent with the uses, all of the uses in the area. And that's where the term compatibility came from. So I do think it's a different mindset in terms of how it's looked at. And I don't know that mindset, again, I'm speaking for myself, Ed's not here,
Right.
Catherine's not here. It would be helpful if they would be here to express their views as well, because I think they felt the same way. That language was created collaboratively, and the previous responses that came back from the legal committee were reviewed by the 3 of us, and it was determined that the proposals weren't acceptable. So it would be great if they Catherine, I wish she were here as well.
Yeah,
but-
no, that's life. All right.
But-
So, that was very helpful to me, Mark, to understand how you're framing this up. And then gives Jenny and I an opportunity to talk offline. And I suspect what we'll do is put forth some language. And then for purposes of the report that needs first draft, we had a rough draft that I sent out last week. Next Tuesday by midnight, you'll get the second draft for review at the work group. And it probably will just have the current state of the discussion. We have, here's the introductory paragraph, and we've got, version A, version B, and maybe version C, and maybe version D. And that's that. We'll capture it, won't be able to take it any further. But I appreciate you guys' efforts to do this. And, I just want you to suggest that you sit back and wait with impending amazement at what the Lucker Imparati team will do with this particular
Hold your breath there.
document. Yeah. So go forth, do good, avoid evil, and we'll talk soon. Thank you all very much.
And I will call
Thanks,
you.
everyone, for the discussion.
Take care. Bye-bye.
See ya.